Being an informed citizen is not always easy. You want to know what's going on, to stay up to date with the big news stories that affect your fellow humans across the planet. But the non-stop headlines makes it difficult to completely understand what's happening. This is where we hope the explanation from the BBC World Service can help. I'm Anu Anand, and in this series I ask some of my BBC colleagues to help me break down big global news events, using archive recordings made on the ground to make sense of why these stories are important.
The spaces that people can run to for safety are shrinking every day here.
Today, we look at Afghanistan and ask how its political history dictates the attitudes towards women's rights in the country. This is The Explanation from the BBC World Service. The BBC's Yogita Limaye is usually based in Mumbai, India, just a few hours' flight from nearby Afghanistan, where she's spent a lot of her time reporting.
When I met this 17-year-old girl in Kabul, throughout our conversation, she wept and she wept about not being able to go to school.
I'm devastated. I've studied for 11 years despite the risks. After all these struggles, we are forced to sit at home.
In 2021, the Taliban, an extremist Islamic group of militants known for forcing women to quit their jobs, stay home, and cover up from head to toe, and publicly stoning to death those accused of breaking these rules, took over the country for a second time.
And I think in that house that day, I found it really hard to disconnect the journalist in me from the woman in me.
I miss my classmates, my teachers, my books, everything. I wanted to be someone and do something with my life, but all of that is gone and I am left in darkness.
That is when it really struck me what this means. That is the face that I remember now every single time I hear a girl is not able to get an education.
Desperation on a scale not seen in decades. Thousands have arrived in Kabul in the past few days. Forced to leave everything behind.
The Taliban's second period of rule is just the latest development in a story of conflict, human rights abuses, and ideological warfare going back decades. Women's rights in Afghanistan, covered so much in the news, have changed with the country's politics, from monarchy to communism to civil war, extremist religious rule, and the presence of international troops. Stay tuned to The Explanation over the next 15 minutes to understand how each political movement has changed what Afghan women can and cannot do. Yogita, let's look at politics and women's rights, because the two things are intertwined in Afghanistan's history. If we go back, way back before the Taliban to the 1920s, monarchs ruled Afghanistan.
They were ruled by King Amanullah Khan, who was quite influenced by the Western world, the way people lived, the way people dressed, rights for women, and that's in many ways what he tried to introduce in his own country. So he banned child marriage, he actively discouraged men from having more than one wife. There were many schools for girls, universities opened. He tried to bring this sort of what he saw as modern culture to Afghanistan. In 1929, he was dethroned, and the large part of that reason was because of these progressive policies that he was trying to bring to the country, which was in conflict with what a lot of the people in the country believed or saw as Islamic. You then had King Zahir Shah take over in 1933. He ruled for 4 decades until 1973. In the 1960s, he helped draft a constitution in which women were given the right to vote, they were given the right to run for office. And so yes, absolutely, it is not true that girls' rights to go to school or women's rights to work was introduced in Afghanistan in 2001. It existed decades before that.
In 1973, a key moment for Afghanistan, something I'd never really understood before. King Zahir Shah's cousin Daud Khan overthrew the monarchy. Khan declared himself the president of the First Republic of Afghanistan.
The king went into exile. The new regime has the backing of Afghanistan's small but powerful army, and that in turn is supplied and equipped by the Soviet Union.
But only a few years later, in 1978, he was assassinated by the Afghan military and communists. This moment is really important because this is when the real power struggle for Afghanistan begins. This is when Afghanistan starts to change from a relatively stable and prosperous country to a hotbed of conflict.
I think the people who were opposed to these ideas of equal rights for women, these ideas of communism, they found it a lot easier to actually start an uprising in the country against this government because it was no longer a king they were challenging. It was now a president. It was a republic. So in many ways, for the people who felt loyalty to a king, that was done away with once the monarchy was abolished.
The abolition of Afghanistan's monarchy created a power vacuum, and different forces rushed in to fill it, including Afghan communists supported by the then Soviet Union, the one-party communist state predating modern Russia. It lasted from 1922 to 1991. Soviet involvement would forever change Afghanistan, and these political battles profoundly impacted women's rights.
During the communist-backed regime, families were forced to send their girls to school at gunpoint. That sort of gives you a sense of what that conflict was, that society maybe at large was not ready for a rapid sort of set of reforms to be brought in. And women's rights, I think, what women are allowed to do, how they should dress, has been at the center of both these ideologies, I would say, and therefore has been at the center of conflict in Afghanistan for decades.
Then in 1979, an event that would forever change the course of Afghan history.
At about 6, a convoy of Russian tanks arrived, and you can hear the gunfire from the Russian tanks which are blocked on the road.
Kabul itself has appeared quiet, with the population observing warily the new regime.
The Soviet invasion unleashed a war that eventually destroyed Afghanistan. At least 1 million people died. Cities were leveled. Millions became refugees. The Soviet war lasted a decade. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan unleashed a wider Cold War conflict, with the United States, Britain, and China arming different rebel groups inside Afghanistan against the Soviets. Collectively, these local Afghan rebel factions were known as the Mujahideen, which means those engaging in jihad or struggle. These local fighters did eventually push Soviet forces out in February 1989. But once the Soviets were gone, Mujahideen factions turned against each other. The result was another period of war lasting roughly 5 years.
Many of the fighters are the children of war. They have grown up knowing nothing else. Once there was a common struggle to drive the Russians out. Now there is no logic, only a tyranny of factions. It is Afghanistan which is crumbling around them.
Meanwhile, a new political force was looming, one that would shock and surprise the world.
In just 6 months, the Taliban have seized a third of Afghanistan. By the standards of this long war, it's been a lightning advance. These ruins and the people who died in them are the worst indictment of Afghanistan's failed political leaders.
Yogita, let's talk about the Taliban. Who were they and where did they come from?
The Taliban emerged in northern Pakistan in religious schools there that were believed to be funded by Saudi Arabia. They were able to, I think, gain followers and gain popularity quite quickly in the 1990s.
The word Taliban comes from the Arabic talib, meaning student. The Taliban took over parts of the country beginning in 1994. In 1996, with support from Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, the Taliban seized Kabul. Yogita, what was that period like for women? What was the result of Taliban rule?
Women were not allowed to leave their homes unless they were escorted by a male member of their family. They were not allowed to go to school. They were not allowed to work. And there were many instances that have been recorded by human rights groups where women who were seen to violate any of these rules were stoned to death in public. And really that's what their regime came to be known for, its brutality.
Yesterday we opened another front on the war on terrorism. We're going to be ongoing and relentless as we tighten the net of justice.
On September 11th, 2001, the Islamist group Al-Qaeda carried out coordinated attacks on America. Planes crashed into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Weeks later, President George W. Bush announced attacks against Taliban targets in Afghanistan. He said the Taliban had refused to hand over Al-Qaeda leaders who had helped plan the attacks.
Kabul tonight, the mountains around it illuminated by missile flashes and the air thick with anti-aircraft fire. Thousands of feet overhead, American stealth bombers were mounting the second night of what promises to be a long campaign.
The U.S. invasion of Afghanistan would turn out to be the longest war in U.S. history, with more than 2,400 American troops and tens of thousands of Afghans killed. What does 2001 and the U.S., the invasion after 9/11, what does that represent for Afghanistan?
Well, I think for this generation of Afghans, particularly people in their 20s, that post-2001 life is the only thing they have known. Women became members of parliament, women were allowed in all kinds of jobs. They were living in a society, especially women and girls, where yes, it was conservative, yes, it was patriarchal to a great extent socially, but at the same time they were able to pursue their ambitions, they were able to get an education, they were able to go to university. While it might have been a very different picture for people in rural parts of the country. If you go to any village in the country and you ask women, do you want your daughter to go to school? Do you want to have a job? Do you want to be able to go out and work? You will never get no as an answer. They will always say yes.
In 2020, President Donald Trump signed a deal to withdraw U.S. and allied troops from Afghanistan by the following year.
I'll be meeting personally with Taliban leaders in the not-too-distant future, and we'll be very much hoping that they will be doing what they say they're going to be doing. They will be killing terrorists.
During President Trump's tenure, what was quite clear was that he wanted to withdraw all troops from Afghanistan. He wanted to be able to say to the people of America that I've ended the Afghan war. And in order to do that in a way that they were safe and not attacked by the Taliban, the US felt that it had to enter talks with the Taliban. It drew sharp criticism from the Afghan government at the time, which was not a party to the talks. And then finally there was a deal signed between the Trump administration and the Taliban in Doha in February 2020. And I think the key points of that agreement was that the Taliban would not allow the territory of Afghanistan to be used to threaten the security of the US or any of its allies. They would enter into a peace negotiation with the Afghan government. Those actually reached no conclusion. The Afghan government was insistent that they wanted whatever form of government would be there would be a democratic one. Right from the beginning, the Taliban was very clear that what they wanted was an Islamist emirate, and that's what we see in Afghanistan now.
Today, women in Herat, Afghanistan's third largest city, protested for their rights. Many are in hiding, fearing reprisal. The Taliban, though, deny they're going door to door looking to target people.
So after the government established, they will not trust us. They will be the same Taliban as 20 years ago.
The Taliban, in fact, while being in those negotiations with the US, the public statements that they have made are that they're committed to women's rights, that they are not opposed to girls going to school or women working, that women and girls would be given rights according to the Sharia law. When you ask them, what do you mean by that? That is where all of their arguments seem to end, but without any clear explanation of what they mean by that. In terms of how they've taken power, Kabul was taken without destruction, without bloodshed. But at the same time, there are confirmed cases from many parts of the country of reprisal killings against people who worked for the previous government. The Taliban itself is not homogeneous. There does seem to be a gap between what the leaders say and what you see on the ground. In order to establish diplomatic relations with countries around the world, we might see that there are rights being given in some parts but not all. So if they're able to deliver on their promises uniformly across the country, I think that is what they need to be judged by.
This latest chapter has already profoundly impacted Afghanistan. According to the United Nations Refugee Agency, more than 600,000 Afghans fled in 2021, bringing the total number of Afghan refugees globally to nearly 6 million. The UN says nearly 80% of recently displaced Afghans are women and children.
Women's rights and what they're allowed to do and not do have been at the center of this conflict for decades and continue to be at the center of the different ideologies that have been fighting for dominance in Afghanistan over the past several decades. I asked the former Vice President of Afghanistan, Amrullah Saleh, why his country had seen decades of conflict. He said it's because of our geography. We are at the heart of Asia. Anyone who influences us feels that they have influence over this whole region. And that is why this is such a hotly contested territory that countries from around the world are interested in. The other key thing actually about how women's rights and all of this is connected came from Shukriya Barakzai, who said that right now, if the world allows this kind of discrimination to go unchallenged in Afghanistan, then there is no reason why we should believe that these ideas, this kind of ideology, will remain within the boundaries of Afghanistan. It is something that the world needs to worry about.
Thanks, Yogita. That's the BBC's Yogita Limai, explaining how and why women's rights in Afghanistan change with the country's turbulent politics. You've been listening to The Explanation with me, Anu Anand, on the BBC World Service. Stay up to date with the latest developments on Afghanistan by visiting the BBC News website. And if you want to hear more episodes of The Explanation, you can subscribe now on BBC Sounds.
Thank you for listening. There will be more from the documentary podcast soon. The documentary is just one of our BBC World Service podcasts. There are many others to choose from.
Can you think of a story that your daughter needs to hear? I'm Namulanta Kombo, and for my new podcast, Dear Daughter, I'm gathering letters from people all over the world, full of inspiring, emotional, and sometimes funny personal stories. We've received lots of lovely letters so far, and you'll be able to hear some of them soon in our first episode. In the meantime, I'd love it if you could join in by writing your own letter to your daughter. Perhaps you could tell them a story from your life that might help them with theirs. Perhaps you have a piece of advice that you think they should follow. Perhaps you'd want to make them laugh. Or maybe you'd write something that you'd never be able to tell them in person. Whatever you write, please give us as much detail as possible and explain to your daughter why you're telling them your story. You can send us your letter by going to bbcworldservice.com/Dear Daughter. That's bbcworldservice.com/Dear Daughter.